This video is for teachers who are looking for an overview of Day 7 of Unit 1 in the Passport to Social Studies curriculum, the focus question of which is what changed as a result of English settlement in Massachusetts, with the objective of students being able to continue their exploration of how the settlement of Massachusetts colonies was a turning point in the early history of the United States. Additionally, this lesson includes modeling of the third step of the Turning Points tool, which you can see here is the students being able to determine elements of continuity and change. Since this entire process is an integral component of this unit, I will also discuss some approaches you might take as you model and guide your students through this step. There are separate videos for steps 1 and 2 of this tool. Steps 4 and 5 are combined into one. Each of these videos uses unique sources from the individual lessons. However, the methods and procedures are applicable regardless of the content or event being evaluated as a turning point. The event under consideration in this lesson is the establishment of the Massachusetts colony as a factor in the displacement of Indigenous people due to English colonization. Before getting started, as might be the case with several lessons in this unit, students may find the content distressing or upsetting. However, it is still important that we study these events and critically read the related sources. In this Note to Teachers slide, links are shared to resources from Facing History and Ourselves, Teaching Tolerance, and also the National Museum of the American Indian, that all have strategies and ideas for you on how to address this. One last thing to consider is this reminder that we continue to use our virtual classroom as a place for students to express their discomfort and feelings of anger or distress that may emerge from learning about these topics in history. This lesson has two distinct segments that will reinforce each other as the students progress. First, they will walk through the concept of settler colonialism, and second, they will identify factors relating to continuity and change, which is the focal point of Step 3 in the Turning Points tool. Before engaging in the activity of using two images to further their understanding of settler colonialism, you might need to review this concept, which was introduced several lessons earlier in Day 2 in a text written by Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. As part of that lesson, the students completed a 3-2-1 activity, and one way you could refresh this concept in their minds is to have the students review what they wrote, specifically the 3 main ideas and the one question that they came up with. And then you can kind of compile them into a class list that is visible to all the synchronous students. After giving students time to review these things, you can then pose some of the questions that they generated in that activity and ask them to reflect on whether they've gained enough knowledge or perspective to answer any of those questions. And of course, you can encourage volunteers to share their responses with the class. If you are looking for a way to accommodate students who are doing this asynchronously, you can also set up this activity on a note-sharing site such as Padlet, where students can type their answers and they are saved. Taking this approach would also support synchronous students who may get support from referring back to it at a later point in this lesson. When it comes time for the students to analyze both of these images and connect them to settler colonialism, there is a model done for the first, Pilgrims going to church, and you can see the entries right here. If necessary, you can modify this to accommodate the needs of your students. For instance, if you wanted to do a think aloud of this entire process, you can make multiple copies of this slide and then delete the entries on the next. And then for each one that you add after it, you can add one of the entries, and that'll allow the students to visually see your verbal walkthrough as you're progressing through this process. If your students are more comfortable with this procedure, another option is to have the students attempt it first on their own independently, then provide them with this slide and allow them to self-assess and reflect on their process. If you opt for this method, though, make clear to the students that visuals like this are very much open to interpretation, and by no means is what is listed in the C column an exhaustive list, as well as the connections and inferences being completely subjective and unique. Instead, stress to them that they should reflect on the process itself. They will then repeat this routine for the second image, Seal of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. This introduction segment of the lesson concludes with a series of prompts that are designed to have the students synthesize what they learned from each image and apply it to the larger concept of settler colonialism. Knowing that later in this lesson, the students will be looking for continuities and changes surrounding this event, you may want to add something that will assist them with this, such as asking them to make preliminary observations taken directly from both images about what might have changed for the Indigenous people and the land on which they lived due to settler colonialism. The lesson now segues to the continuation of the work with the Turning Points tool, and by this point we are up to step 3. Like it says in the guidance for instruction slide that precedes this one, the student should work on these first 2 steps of the Turning Points tool independently after reading and analyzing these 2 sources, Indigenous Communities and the English Settlements in the 17th Century Map, as well as a secondary source reading titled Settlement in Massachusetts. If you have been following the Passport to Social Studies curriculum, they may have already completed the contextualization of this event in day 1. However, they likely have some additional content knowledge garnered from the last few lessons that is relevant, so you may want to direct them to review what they entered on that first day and to add to it. Again, depending how closely you follow this curriculum and the adjustments you made along the way, they may not have completed step 2 for this specific event. I know in day 6 we go through a model for this step using the establishment of race-based chattel slavery as a turning point. So if they haven't yet identified the defining characteristics of European settlement on indigenous displacement, the time and resources should be made available for them to do so now. Also, as this was already modeled and practiced asynchronously in previous lessons, the amount of autonomy you afford them is up to you. As they progress through this, though, definitely monitor student progress and provide support as needed. Students doing this asynchronously can always refer back to the previously completed models as guides. When the students are ready for step 3, be mindful of this guidance for instruction slide, encouraging you to do a think aloud with the synchronous students, and the students that are going to be doing this at a later time independently should be relying on the notes that are in orange. And just like I mentioned earlier, you can make copies of this slide and manipulate it to support your think aloud process. For instance, in this first copy that I made, I deleted both the thought bubble and entries, so students will see me start at the same point they will be, which is a blank form. Then on the next slide, I decided to have the thought bubble remain, which I will walk the students through verbally. Your students may benefit from an explanation of why the concept of land was decided on as a focal concept, especially since when they apply this process to future events, it will likely not be the same, and they will have to determine this on their own. To do so, I would explain to the students that there are 2 things they should refer to when making this decision. The first is the context that they created in step 1, which for convenience I included the exemplar slide right here. Reinforce the notion that all of these steps support each other by having them review all of the entries. Then draw their attention to this question: what was the previous historical period like? And focus on this last statement right here. Over time, thousands of Europeans would arrive and settlements would be created on what was indigenous territory. Taken together, all of these support the idea that land should be something we consider when looking for continuities and changes. Second, have them look at the 2 sources that were part of this lesson that they analyzed and read, and apply this factor in their search for evidence of trends that changed and continued. I would recommend you have the models already annotated, which will visually support your verbal modeling. You can see here that I used the see, connect, and infer approach to analyze this map, and that I highlighted pertinent details in the reading. Point out to the students the inference I made on the map and how it deals with land. And also this highlighted passage in the text that talks about how the Massachusetts colony was different from Jamestown because this one was designed from the onset to be permanent. Then bring the students back to step 3. At this point, you can continue with your think aloud, or since you just identified some factors relating to both continuity and change, you could also facilitate a class discussion where students create these entries together. Before students move ahead to complete the rest of this step independently, though, you might want to consider polling the students using like a Zoom feature or some other available online platform to have them self-assess their comfort with the step, which will identify for you which students might need some additional support or clarification. Upon completion, as a final check for understanding, have the students respond to both of these prompts that will require them to reflect on the changes they noticed and also evaluate the sources that they used.